fish. It's much harder to do work on fish. We're starting to do a little bit of surveillance with the fish in coming to the U.S., but that, again, is really just a sideline. It requires much greater resource availability to be able to work with marine systems, and there just hasn't been that kind of investment for research at this point. But we are looking at the microbial communities, the bacterial communities and fungal communities. We're looking at the trees, looking at tree growth rates, again, replicating a number of the sorts of studies that we did in Chernobyl to look at ecosystem level effects, not just population level things.
What sort of results are you finding at Fukushima that suggest that the mutations and the changes will follow the same pathway that's been followed more than 30 years after Chernobyl?
It's really too early to say for sure that they're identical. There are a lot of reasons why they should be different. But to begin with, the first observation we made from the very first year of our study was that so there are a number of species that are common to both Chernobyl and Fukushima in the bird community. I think we had 14 or 15 species of birds that were the same, and they showed similar patterns of effect due to radiation. So that was sort of the first clue. Again, the fact that the birds show this strong dose-dependent decline in population sizes. We published a paper in December where we actually took the 7,000 birds that we've counted over the last few years, and in collaboration with a group in France at the IRSN, they actually calculated a dose to each and every individual bird. And this is what the health physicists like to see, of course. They like to see that radiation exposure in terms of a dose, because doses can be different than just the exposures. And so we did this in collaboration and basically found the same pattern of declines with dose that we've seen in Chernobyl. And so this, again, is that level of convergence is really striking and really speaks to a likely common mechanism underlying the two effects, namely ionizing radiation. So we're pretty confident that that level. We've also been looking at brain size, in the rodents, and we're seeing evidence. It's not published yet, but it will be soon, I hope. Again, parallels in the two places with respect to rodent development. And we're just finishing the analysis of tree growth before and after the disaster. Again, in Chernobyl, we found very striking impacts on the pine trees of the area. We're looking at 4 species of trees in Fukushima. They've all been measured. It's just time to analyze the data and actually write up the paper.
In terms of the kind of radiation that is hitting in these two areas, are they the same, or is there some difference in the radioactive isotopes?
In Chernobyl, because there was a nuclear fire burning along with a regular fire, the graphite rods were burning, fission was undergoing at the time, it actually volatilized a very wide range of different isotopes, in addition to the usual characters, the radioactive noble gases. There was cesium released in both places, but the strontium was not volatilized in Fukushima. It wasn't hot enough during the meltdown to volatilize the strontium. At least that's the story we're told. Whereas in Chernobyl, enormous quantities of strontium are released across the environment. It's been well documented, well measured. Strontium is everywhere. The strontium-90 has about the same half-life as cesium-137. It's 29 versus 30 years. And so it's around still in great quantities. It's hard to measure because it's a pure beta emitter. So a standard gamma dosimeter does not measure it very accurately, although a Geiger counter can pick it up if it's close to it. Of course, at Chernobyl, there was lots of plutonium. This spent fuel was actually volatilized as well in the unspent fuel and released in this sort of cataclysmic event, this fire that was burning, sort of like a volcano spewing radioisotopes into the atmosphere, injecting it into the atmosphere. And so they were transported far and wide, hundreds of miles and longer. Whereas in Fukushima, on the terrestrial side of the event, really was limited to the noble gases, radioactive iodine early on, and the cesium-134 and cesium-137. And so now, 4 or 5 years later, that's what we see on the terrestrial side. We see the cesium is still there, cesium-134 and cesium-137. There's very little evidence, as far as we can tell, for strontium We see the occasional blip of some of the other isotopes that are common, silver isotopes, for instance. But on the terrestrial side, again, on the land, it's really just that one isotope. And also the other issue is that the amount of land that was contaminated to a high level was considerably less than what happened in Chernobyl, where vast areas, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, were contaminated. So it's a completely different event in terms of the terrestrial impacts. The marine side now, that's another issue. The inputs to the marine system were vast, extremely large, probably, again, on the order of the Chernobyl event, and certainly a much wider array of isotopes have been put into the ocean, certainly lots and lots of strontium as well as cesium, and there's certainly indications of some plutonium and other isotopes making it into the marine system as well. So again, that's a completely different event, and that's ongoing, and we know almost nothing about it. So that's the big problem right now.
In your research on either site, what has been your biggest surprise?
There's been many. The biggest surprise and the biggest disappointment has been that there hasn't been fundamentally much greater interest on the part of granting agencies and regulatory agencies. And we sort of could understand why interest in the Chernobyl disaster was waning into the 2000s as we were getting involved in it. Everyone thought that this kind of disaster could never happen again, that Chernobyl was a unique event, unique to the former Soviet Union in many ways, unique to that particular reactor design. It could never happen in the modern world, in the Western world. And then Fukushima happens, and of course, everybody realizes, oh my God, it can happen here. If it can happen in Japan, it can happen anywhere. And so we really kind of expected that there would be much broader interest in supporting a large multinational effort to conduct as much research as possible and to take advantage of this opportunity to learn so that we might know much better how to deal with these kinds of accidents, small and large, in the future. And so, yeah, big disappointment, big surprise that there hasn't been a much broader array of interest. Now, certainly there's been lots of public interest, lots of interest by the media, just not any evidence of investment by government agencies or other folks that should be investing in this kind of activity.
Given that you have such a tin ear turned to you by government agencies, where have you gotten your funding to be able to do this work?
Like a lot of people, we've done anything and everything we can to support our hobbies. And, for scientists, of course, research is everything. It's our whole life. And so we invest whatever it takes to do what we think is important to do. And certainly that's no different than most other avocations, I think. And so I was just very, very fortunate that my university was very supportive of what we were doing and has helped us out considerably over the last 15 years. We've had a number of grants from, the National Science Foundation, from the National Geographic Foundation, from the National Institutes of Health, as well as several small philanthropies that have promoted our research. But of course, as I like to say, the biggest funding source really has been personal prostitution.
Oh, please clarify, please.
Yeah. Basically working at other unrelated activities to support my research habit, and that has really been the primary source of our funding.
What, if any, pushback have you gotten from the officials out there, be it government or organizations or the nuclear industry? Has there been any concerted attempt to contradict your work or put roadblocks up to it?
I don't think there's been any well-orchestrated conspiracy by any group to put up roadblocks. There hasn't been much help from a number of these groups. I guess it's kind of a passive-aggressive thing. The lack of support in its own way is a roadblock, of course. Scientists are craftsmen, and, like a plumber, if you don't pay the plumber, he's not going to come do the work, and scientists are essentially craftsmen, and without funding resources, most scientists are not able to conduct research. So most of the roadblocks have been this kind of passive-aggressive kind of thing. But for the most part, the only really vocal criticisms we've had to face have been surprisingly from some of the more extreme anti-nuclear groups that have gone a little bit hypercritical at times. That's been kind of a surprise as well.
Has there been any outreach to the United Nations to do a more coordinated international job of monitoring the impact in these two areas?
Again, depending on who you speak to, if you talk to the folks at the International Atomic Energy Agency, which of course is the agency at the UN in charge of regulating or making recommendations concerning regulations and promoting the peaceful use of the atom. And
leave it alone! That's the peaceful use of the atom! Leave it in the ground and leave it alone. But be that as it may, please continue.
Yeah. So there have been, I think they have invested in reviewing the literature as it is and as such as they believe it to be, and have advisors here and there to make recommendations on how best to clean up and reduce the potential health risks to the local population. But I don't think there's been any major investment in any kind of research initiative. The Japanese, I think, have started a kind of research initiative, again, through the government agencies that are there, but nothing that would be open or available to independent scientists at academic institutions. So it's been rather limited.
I have to ask, with you having been at Chernobyl so many times and having been at Fukushima only months after the disaster happened, being up close and personal with two of the worst, most contaminated nuclear hotspots on the planet, what have you done and what do you do to protect your health?
Yeah, that question has become increasingly important. Most of the radiation that we experience comes in the form of gamma radiation, and as such, like X-rays, there's really no way to protect yourself from it other than to not be there. And so to get the work done, you have no choice but to subject yourself to some extra gamma radiation. We minimize our exposure to the other forms of radiation, the beta and alpha emitters, by trying not to eat the local food, trying not to drink water, trying to keep the dirt out from under our fingernails and not breathe the dust. But like journalists going to war zones, there's really no way to avoid the bullets when you're actually there. And so you just have to, again, minimize the potential risk as best you can. Try to be careful. But if you want to do this research, if you think this needs to be done, then there's no other way to do it than to be there.
And how is your health at this point? Are you holding together?
Yeah, good question. Unfortunately, the ravages of time are my main issue. None of us are getting any younger, unfortunately. And this brings me to the next point, which is that because there's been this lack of investment, the lack of resources, the other thing that you can't do without resources is train new students, bring new students and postdocs, young people. To get them involved, you've got to provide incentives. You've got to be able to cover their expenses. And we're not training the young people that we really need to train to continue this work into the future.
Where is your work going now? What's next, and what do you project for yourself and the researchers with whom you do work in the near and the far future?
We think it's critically important that we continue to monitor these populations for probably several decades. We jumped into Chernobyl 15 years after the event, and we missed so much of what happened during those first 15 years. That was another reason we felt compelled to get there as soon as we could, again, to fill in some of those gaps that really weren't documented following the Chernobyl disaster. But it's very clear that this is a dynamic process. It's an ongoing process that takes many years to reach any kind of equilibrium, if it does at all. Again, as evolutionary biologists, as population geneticists, we suspect that there will be some kind of equilibrium reached between immigration of animals and plants from adjacent areas that are not contaminated and those that are experiencing this mutagenesis as a result of the radiation, and that the dynamics will be different in different places depending on the size of the areas that are affected and other environmental factors. But back up 10 years ago, when we started doing work in this area, nobody thought